Hi everyone, thank you for this opportunity. It's a privilege to be here. Before I begin my presentation, I would like to just highlight that this research, as you can see, memory and identity from the standpoint of Hazara women. Oh, I can see it here as well, sorry. This is a very personal research, and I do get emotional when I present my research. So therefore, I would like to ask you to cooperate or collaborate with me, particularly when I present the quotes of my research participants. I would like you to read them for yourselves. I will just take a break during that time. And secondly, I did not have any pictures because my research was mainly done via telephone. And that's why I used all these pictures that you can see from Hazara women and their acts of defiance and resistance. I retrieved them from Google. Most of them, not all of them, they don't have any. Does this even work? Yes, okay. So most of them are from Google. I did not even find the authors. So yeah, apologies for that. The Hazaras, as Francis Shaw highlighted in the earlier presentation, the Hazaras are one of the most persecuted and historically oppressed ethnic groups in Afghanistan. The history of the Hazara people is significantly shaped by the experiences of wars, atrocities, and the subsequent mass displacement and forced migration of the ethnic group to neighboring countries such as Iran and Pakistan, as well as to the West. As an ethnic subaltern, existing studies about the different facets of Hazara history, memory, culture, and identity are very limited. However, Hazara women's voices, experiences, and epistemologies are not fairly and adequately represented in these studies. This inadequate representation has produced three outcomes. Firstly, the exclusion and marginalization of Hazara women's voices, experiences, and subjective interpretations of history, culture, and identity. Two, the homogenization and reduction of their experiences to mere passive victims of the Hazara of the history of wars and violence. And three, the emergence of an exclusionary, androcentric, or male-centered and gender-blind knowledge about the Hazaras, creating a gap in our collective understanding about the social group. As a Hazara woman, and myself as a privileged Hazara woman, I took it upon myself to address this gap by studying memory and identity from the perspective of Hazara refugee women in Britain. In doing so, I asked, how do Hazara women, as an epistemically excluded group, remember, interpret, and relate to the Hazara history and identity against the backdrop of their situation as refugees? By foregrounding the voices and experiences and subjective interpretations of Hazara refugee women, in this study, I tend to pursue two interrelated objectives. The first one is to demarginalize Hazara women's knowledge and subjective interpretation of history, identity, and culture. And the second one is to contribute to a more inclusive and gender-sensitive knowledge about the ethnic group, particularly in the context of memory studies. In terms of my methodology, as I said at the beginning of this presentation, I used telephone. I interviewed around, this is a qualitative study, and I used semi-structured interviews to document ethnic Hazara refugee women's life narratives in their own words. Most of, aside from 3 research participants that I did conduct the interview in Paris, and all of them, they were done in via telephone. And in total, 10 Hazara refugee women were interviewed who were from varying levels of education, various age groups, places of origin, and migration backgrounds. And also participants come from various parts of Hazara Jat or Hazaristan, the central highlands of Afghanistan, which is considered the native homeland of the Hazaras. The fieldwork for this research was conducted in London, Milton Keynes, and Oxford, Oxfordshire. To just briefly highlight my research findings, 2 crucial factors are evident in the participants' narratives that also serve as a point of departure from the existing male-centered knowledge about the Hazaras. These factors are, first one, the centrality of gender in these women's recollections and relationship to the Hazara history, culture, and identity. And 2, their self-identification as active resistors to the gendered and ethnic oppression, both in their homeland and as refugees. This is contradictory to their representation as mere passive victims of atrocities that the Hazaras have undergone. In terms of my analysis, Maurice Halbwachs, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his name properly, he's one of the a very well-known scholar on collective memory. He asserts that individual memory is nevertheless part or an aspect of group memory. As an epistemically oppressed, historically subaltern ethnic woman, Hazara women's memories of the past speak of the intertwining nature of their individual pasts predicated on and formulated through memories of their membership to two oppressed collectivities, the Hazaras and the women. Hazara women are effectively a marginalized and oppressed group, women, within another marginalized and oppressed group, Hazaras. This is what Kimberly Crenshaw has termed as double marginalization and oppression. In talking about the past, participants do not only centralize gender in their stories, but more importantly, the act of remembering itself, the very nature of remembering, becomes gendered. In other words, in their recollections, these women not only emphasize on the distinct and specific vulnerabilities, experiences, and the central role of Hazara women in the preservation and transmission of memory, identity, and culture, but their very recollections and mode of delivery is gendered. This is precisely what I call a gender act of remembering. As a double marginalized and oppressed group, seeing the past through a gender lens, however, renders these women's individual memory an aspect of the Hazaras' collective memory, while simultaneously representing a challenge to that very collective memory and knowledge about the group. This point is instantiated in the quote from one of my participants, who talks about the armed attack by the Taliban on her native village, in which many of her community members were killed. So I would like to ask you to please read this quote. This quote makes the severity of the conflict tangible through its distinct impact on women and its ensuing gender role and responsibilities. While the responsibility of taking arms in defense of their homeland falls upon men's shoulders, the caring responsibility of children, the vulnerable, the livestock falls on the shoulders of women. More importantly, the quotation highlights the complex interplay between gender and age in determining and differentiating women's responsibilities during conflict. This double age-determined caring responsibility of women during the conflict makes the distinct and varying responsibilities of women visible. Older women staying behind to look after the livestock also speaks to the collective hope of the community for the restoration of normalcy and life and the end of the conflict. It is women who safeguard that very collective hope at the cost of their own lives. Additionally, participants constantly made reference to their mothers' and grandmothers' stories and first-hand experiences of the endemic violence against the group, appreciating the rich and encompassing character of their experiences. For example, when telling her story, Gauhar Begum referred to senior female members of her family, saying, please read this. Well, the participants' emphasis on women's experiences in her family and her recognition of those experiences as far richer sources of knowledge about the past speaks to the central role of these women in the memorization, preservation, and transmission of knowledge to their children. Such gendered recollection and transmission of memory illuminates the past in a way that contests the androcentric and exclusionary knowledge about the Hazaras, while enriching a more inclusive and gender-sensitive knowledge of these collective traumatic events. It is this gendered interpretation of the past that foregrounds the subjectivity of women in the act of remembering and nuances our understanding of past atrocities against the Hazara ethnic group in Afghanistan. In summary, these quotes highlight the intergenerational role of Hazara women in the oral transmission of memory, connecting past, present, and future, grandmothers, mothers, and children. In addition to centralizing gender in their narratives, participants also speak of resistance, a multi-layered resistance to myriad intersecting gender and ethnic-based structures of oppression and exclusion. A resistance that is both individual and collective, intergenerational and transnational. What affords this woman's resistance such a character is the fact that despite forced displacement and immigration caused by a century-long ethnic persecution, including decades of wars in Afghanistan, their resistance not only persists, but is consolidated across countless changes in their spatial and temporal circumstances. Participants' stories reveal three interconnected levels of resistance to three interconnected structures of power: gender, ethnic, and epistemological power structures. These three levels of resistance are: number one, individual resistance to gender-based illiteracy; two, collective resistance to the ongoing ethnic persecution of Hazaras in the form of collective demonstration and protests; and number three, epistemological resistance to forgetting. This is achieved through oral poetry and oral stories. In the interest of time, I will only focus on individual resistance to gender-based illiteracy. This is highlighted from one of my research participants, Shireen, during her recollection. So just a few words about Shireen. Shireen is a woman in her late 30s. She has 3 children and has lived in the UK for the past 15 years. When telling her story, she talks about her childhood in a village in Afghanistan in the early 1990s, when her father, like many other young men in the village, was an economic immigrant in Kuwait. Shireen says, "Before the Taliban's rule, I was attending school. Women in the village was encouraging my mom to stop me from attending school, saying, 'She is a grown woman now. Do not let her go to school. She must attend to her handcrafting skills and prepare for marriage.' My mother, who had never gone to school herself, was ignoring their remarks, telling them, 'No, I want my daughter to get an education. I do not want her to remain illiterate like me. It does not matter if she does not acquire any other skills as long as she can read and write. هیچ چیز نداشته باشه، مقصد قلم داشته باشه.' My father, who was in Kuwait, used to send letters to my mother. My mother is illiterate. She could not read the letter. She could not ask the men in the village to read the letter because she did not want them to learn the content. She had to wait for weeks carrying the letter with her until," then she names the name of a lady in the village who was the only literate woman in the village, so that she could be reached to read the letter for her. پشت یک خاتونی باسواد یک هفته میگشت که پیدا کنه، کور پیدا کنه. However, with the Taliban coming to power between 1926 and 2001, women were pushed into the household and girls were forbidden from attending school. Shireen's education did not go beyond primary school, as she continues. I would like to ask you to read this quote, please. As the quotes indicate, such resistance to an entrenching patriarchal power relation stems from these women's first-hand experiences of being denied education due to their gender and its visceral impact on their everyday lives. To resist, Uday Chandra asserts, is to minimally apprehend the condition of one's subordination, to endure or withstand those conditions in everyday life, and to act with sufficient intention and purpose to negotiate power relations from below in order to rework them in a more favorable or emancipatory direction. This women's resistance from below thus transcends the mere recognition of their subordinate position. Instead, this women's resistance is predicated on the immediate and justifiable fear that the future generation, their daughters, will find themselves in a similar subordinate position if the system continues uninterrupted. To resist is to reshape gendered power relations from below in a more favorable and emancipatory direction that could break the cycle of gendered illiteracy for their daughters, the future generation of the Hazaras. Just to conclude, the significance of gender in these women's memories and their self-identification as active resistors calls into question both their epistemic oppression and exclusion and their misrepresentation as mere passive victims in Hazara history and collective understanding. Studying memory and identity from the standpoint of Hazara women not only calls to challenge the male-centered scholarship about the Hazaras, but more significantly expands the existing scholarship and contributes to a more inclusive and gender-sensitive collective understanding of the Hazaras history as a social group. I would like to leave you with these two quotes from my research participants. And the last one, as it says, "Qalam az mo tano as the hezmoya." Thank you.